Just 5 months after the violence of Selma and the president's civil rights appeal to Congress, Lyndon Johnson signed into law the Voting Rights Act of 1965. 5 days later, the Watts district of Los Angeles erupted in the worst race riots in the city's history. National attention was riveted on the streets of L.A. But the riots there were simply manifestations of the racial tension and rage that simmered in every major U.S. city during the period.
Is it too much to ask you to grant us human dignity? Should we be put down and shot to death for this request? If so, you can aim your gun. What the hell do you think we care about dying if you're going to deny us the right to live?
Poverty, unemployment, police harassment, unfulfilled expectations had created a tinderbox on the streets of inner-city ghettos. The civil rights movement had dismantled the Southern system of segregation and white supremacy, but it had largely ignored the insidious racism that festered elsewhere. Northern blacks were angry, disaffected, and easily seduced by fringe groups.
They call Mr. Muhammad a hate teacher because he makes you hate dope and alcohol.
Malcolm X had emerged in the early 1960s as a radical alternative to Martin Luther King and nonviolence, which he called the philosophy of the fool.
Condemning the racist practices
as the chief spokesman for a black nationalist group called the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X espoused self-reliance and separatism rather than integration. To his admirers, he was a courageous advocate for black rights. But for many others, he symbolized reverse racism, black supremacy, and violence.
In a vicious cycle of poverty, of ignorance, of apathy, of disease, and of death. And they have these old Uncle Tom Negro leaders coming to Harlem telling you and me that times are getting better. Your times will never get better until you make them better.
During his lifetime, Malcolm X did not achieve the notoriety of figures like King, but he was assassinated in 1965, and in death became a near-mythic figure. His revolutionary rhetoric infected many civil rights veterans, especially within the core of SNCC.
You're going to sit in front of your television set and listen to LBJ tell you that violence never accomplishes anything, my fellow Americans. But you see, the real problem with violence is that we have never been violent. We have been too nonviolent.
Under the new leadership of Stokely Carmichael, SNCC assumed a militant posture beginning in 1966. The group's mantra of nonviolence was replaced by the chorus of Black Power. For Americans who were just beginning to warm to the idea of civil rights, Black Power was something altogether different. Martin Luther King considered the slogan, at best, an unfortunate choice of words. Roy Wilkins of the NAACP called it the father of hatred and the mother of violence. John Lewis feared that Black Power would divide the races and the movement. And it did. The new movement challenged the established relationship between whites and blacks. In some communities, Black Power was exercised in the voting booth. In 1967, Cleveland voters elected Carl Stokes as mayor. He was the first Negro to hold the position of chief executive of a major U.S. city. But in other parts of the country, Black Power meant bullets, not ballots. In Oakland, California, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale formed the Black Panther Party. What began as a community organization to provide free breakfasts and liberation schools to ghetto kids ultimately devolved into murder, rape, bank heists, and drug trafficking. The anarchy was not limited to California. Chicago, Newark, Minneapolis, Memphis. In scores of American cities, blacks rebelled against chronic racism and police brutality during the late 1960s. In turn, white America took up arms. Civil rights had become civil war. President Johnson's Great Society, a lawless society. By nearly any measure, the United States was immensely divided in the late 60s. Divided on civil rights, by the war in Vietnam, and by a generation gap without equal in American history. Black Power brought an end to the civil rights movement that began with the Montgomery bus boycott in 1956, but it never achieved mainstream recognition. The majority of Negroes, or blacks, as many now prefer to be called, still look to figures such as Martin Luther King for leadership. In April 1968, Martin Luther King traveled to Memphis, Tennessee to speak in support of striking sanitation workers. The message of hope was familiar, but with an ominous sense of foreboding.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
One day later, King stepped from his room at the Lorraine Motel and was gunned down by an assassin. From coast to coast, America erupted in violence. Edward Kozner of Newsweek recalled,
"It was a Pandora's box flung open, an apocalyptic act that loosed the furies brooding in America's sullen ghettos."
Once again, the heart of America is heavy for a tragedy that denies the very meaning of our land. The life of a man who symbolized the freedom and faith of America has been taken. The dream of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has not died with him. Men who are white, men who are black, must and will now join together, as never in the past, to let all the forces of divisiveness know that America shall not be ruled by the bullet, but only by the ballot of free and of just men.
The civil rights movement could rightfully claim victory in desegregating the South and opening its voting rolls to millions of blacks who had been disenfranchised for a century. But the rioting demonstrated that deep problems remain.
We need to know the answer, I think, to three basic questions about these riots. What happened? Why did it happen? What can be done to prevent it from happening again and again?
President Johnson appointed a special committee to study the violence and race riots of the late 1960s. The Kerner Commission concluded that America was moving toward two separate societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Had warned that frustration and resentment resulting from brutalizing inequality and white racism were fostering violence by blacks. As the 1970s dawned, African Americans were no longer at the back of the bus, but the challenge of achieving true freedom and equality remained. It would be left for the next generation and those who followed to finish, once and for all, what President Lincoln had started.